So I know that I've said this numerous times on this podcast. I have never intended for this to be a political podcast. And when do I ever say things like that? Well, it just always happens to be right before I go into something that is political. And given some of the things that are going on in our country right now, some of the things going on in the world right now, it would be absolutely irresponsible to not get into these things. And there's going to be two of them this week. I'm going to start with the most hockey related one, and then we'll flow out of the Edmonton Oilers into what I consider to be consider one to at least not necessarily be hockey related, but at least have a hockey related angle to it. And so, of course, what we're going to have to talk about here is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So, over the past day or so, there's been a pretty heated debate about whether or not Alexander Ovechkin should have to address in the media what's going on in the Ukraine right now. And there's a lot of people that are saying, oh, well, he's just a hockey player. He doesn't really have anything to do with it. This is a political thing and he's a hockey player. But Alexander Ovechkin has now campaigned with Vladimir Putin in multiple Russian elections. And on one hand, I kind of think to myself that maybe that doesn't really mean as much as it sounds on the surface, because the simple fact of the matter is that, we know this. Let's not be naive about this. The elections in Russia are not free elections. Vladimir Putin, pretty much, he had the thing in the bag because he had pretty much gamed, the election from the very beginning. That is just the way that he has always done it. I mean, even when he had hit his term limits, and he couldn't be the president anymore, and he had to settle for being the prime minister. He just put a puppet in there for just long enough to change the Russian constitution so that he could go on and have 3 more terms as the president and pretty much be the president for the remainder of his life. That is what Vladimir Putin does politically. So let's make no bones about this. I think that in terms of the actual consequences of Alexander Ovechkin campaigning for Vladimir Putin, that's not a difference maker in the election. So let's acknowledge that for a second. But when you look at the history of hockey, especially through the 1970s, the 1980s, even into the 1990s, this has never really been a non-political sport. When the Soviet Union came out and they chose that hockey was going to be the sport that they were going to really focus on turning the screws on internationally. There was a reason why they chose that sport, and there was not very many things that the Soviet Union did not do for the purpose of politics. I don't think it is at all unfair or unreasonable to say that Canada was targeted politically by the Soviet Union and that hockey was kind of their weapon to do it. And hockey, and Canadian hockey in particular, answered the call, and we fought back. And it took a pretty long time to do it because the Russians were, let's say, not the most honest about the status of whether or not their players were amateurs or professionals. They touted them internationally as if they were amateur players, but no, in fact, they were professional players. And that allowed them to kind of appear dominant, at the highest levels of hockey at the time, which were Olympic hockey and the World Championships. It really wasn't until the advent of the Canada Cup that we were able to have best on best play between Canada and the Soviet Union. And looking back on hockey history, we know how exactly that went. Or pardon me, rather I should say that we could have semi-regular best on best hockey because of course the Summit Series, that also qualified as best on best hockey. And so in terms of hockey as a political battlefield between the Eastern Bloc and the Western Bloc, I mean, there was that. And really, in so many ways, that seems like it was the most important theater of that particular conflict. But then there's another one that we also need to keep in mind that a lot of people forget about. And that was the sheer number of players from the Eastern Bloc that came over to Canada and to the United States and to Europe as refugees. Talking, of course, about guys like Stan Mikita, guys like Peter Stastny, actually all of the Stastny brothers, guys like Peter Nedved, guys like Alexander Mogilny. guys who defected and came over here because not only were the opportunities better for a hockey player over here, but in many cases they just could not support the things that they were being made to represent on the international stage. And of course, there was the efforts of people who brought them over. And then of course there were other little things along the way. It was actually not it was not an uncommon thing for Canadian hockey teams that went over to the USSR, to sneak in and smuggle in copies of the Torah for Russian Jews, and take those things and give them, because that was something that Russian Jews, they couldn't get from outside the country. It was actually illegal for them to import copies of their own religious literature. Canadian hockey helped to get something that basic and that simple to an oppressed religious minority in the Soviet Union. And so we can't really pretend that hockey has ever been apolitical, and we shouldn't pretend that hockey is apolitical now. And so in my opinion, this is something that needs to happen. There are some people that are saying that Alexander Ovechkin, that he should be suspended and not be allowed to even make the attempt to break any of Wayne Gretzky's records. I don't really think that I believe in that. I think that would be punishing an individual player, even if he was one that has definitely aligned himself with Putin. I don't think it's right to punish an individual player, for the wrongdoings of his country. Now, that being said, I think that there is something that is coming up within the next year that really ought to be addressed, and that is the fact that the 2023 World Junior Championship currently is scheduled to be in Omsk, Russia. Now, if you don't know where Omsk is, if you're not that familiar with Russian geography, let me tell you where let me tell you where Omsk is, and you are probably not going to believe this when I say this, but Omsk is in bloody Siberia. So for 2 seconds, I want you to consider just the optics of what the IIHF has on the table right now for the next year. So you have Russia aggressively invading the Ukraine, not even just settling for these so-called, separatist areas that they say that they have recognized as separate and sovereign countries, which is, by the way, completely contrary to Westphalian law, which is the basis of international law. It is completely illegal for Russia to do something like that. And so with that going on, suddenly we're going to go have the World Juniors in the place where the Russians used to send all of their political prisoners? No. Obviously, we can't do something like that. We can't do anything even remotely like that. So there's no two ways about this. The 2023 World Junior Championships must be withdrawn from Russia. I don't know where to have them. I mean, there are plenty of Canadian cities that we'd be more than happy to step up. There is there's of course a huge Ukrainian population in Alberta. Hey, I know that we just had them here, and apparently they're going to come back again and play the 2022 season. The 2022 tournament is going to be played in July of 2022. So maybe it would seem a little bit self-indulgent to say that we should bring them back to Alberta and to Edmonton. But I think they would have a very strong symbolic, a very strong symbolic statement in doing something like that. And then, of course, there would be the question of, well, what about the Russian team? Well, obviously, we would not be able to have a Russian team at that tournament. We should definitely not have a Russian team at the World Championships, or the Women's World Championships, or the Women's Junior Championships when they finally do go ahead, which I imagine that they probably will. But obviously, we can't have a Russian team at any of those events. So what are we going to do there? Well, how about this? How about we take that slot that would have been there for the Russian team, and now instead that slot is there for a team of Ukrainian nationals. a team of players of Ukrainian descent from other countries, if that's where you have to go to put a team like that together. And you put them in that place, and you let them play in Russia's place for as long as it takes, for this thing to end, and for as long as it takes for the Russians to make amends for what they're doing right now. And you know what? This just occurred to me right now. But Wayne Gretzky, his family is of Ukrainian descent. Allow Wayne Gretzky, if he so chooses, to step in as the coach or the manager with any other role with this team Ukraine for the 2023 World Juniors and the 2022 World Championships. And it's time this is how hockey should make its political statement on what's going on in the Ukraine right now. But for hockey to make no political statement, for hockey to pretend to be neutral at a time like this, would be for this sport to be turning its back, on the historical legacy that it has in terms of spreading, what freedom there is in the Eastern Bloc. Make no mistake about this, that whatever freedom that is there in no small measure because of the interactions between the Western Bloc and the Eastern Bloc through hockey competition. I mean, history credits Ronald Reagan as being the man that brought down the Iron Curtain, but make no mistake about it, before he did that, years before he did that, that wall had already been breached by guys like Paul Henderson. And so if there's another Iron Curtain sweeping across Eastern Europe right now, staying silent is not an option.